To the 7th Annual Brandyway Festival. And we have the speaker who's unbelievable, Dan Bussey, Mr. Apple himself. And the schedule is this afternoon, this morning and this afternoon, we looked at lots of different kinds of apples and all the parts of the apples to see if we could identify the heirloom ones. And tonight, Daniel is talking about all manner of apples, everything from how do you pick, what's its history, how do you pick an apple, how do you take care of it, what are the diseases you need to worry about, how do you make cider, how do you prune. And then tomorrow, people have already come in, but it's still not too late to bring in an address of an apple that you would like to have ID. So we had several people bring in apples this afternoon, one from Finland, all kinds of Finland, Minnesota, and various other places. It was really pretty amazing. And so we're doing that in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we're touring around and visiting different trees and places where people really you have to see it in place to understand what's going on. And then tomorrow night is a talk about making cider. And he'll get into a little bit of it today. And then Sunday morning is a talk about how to graft and prune trees. So I've learned a lot just talking on the phone to him for like less than an hour. And he talks about how to make a pie. Well, you take 2 apples and one should be lighter than the other. And so one is mushy and one keeps its shape. Or your apples, trees should be dry because then your apples are sweeter and they're not watered down with too much water. It's good to have a full-scale tall tree rather than a dwarf because the roots go deeper into more interesting minerals. Your leaves, your grafting leaves, the vertical ones are leaves and the horizontal ones give apples. So when you prune the vertical one. I think that's right. Anyhow, I give you Dan Bussey.
Thanks, Deb. It's really fun to talk about apples the whole day like we've done. I think it's kind of one of those things that when people who know me and I start talking about apples, they start shying away like, oh no, this is going to go on for a while. But I love apples. I have for a long time. I grew up in the middle of my old family farm orchard. It was planted probably 4 generations before I was. This is in southern Wisconsin. And I just remember these big old trees around the house. My dad built the house kind of in the middle of the surviving trees that were there. And they were probably well over 100 years old when I was a little kid. And it was kind of fun, like I said. As a little kid, you don't think a whole lot about apples. This obviously didn't catch my attention, but you know, the apple drops, it's fun to play with these hard apples. We throw them in tin cans, and my brother wasn't looking, I'd beat one off his head. So that was my experience with apples until later on in the 70s when I decided to build a home. I was in a homestead and I was going to plant fruit trees. And it happened at that time that I ran across a book. There was a magazine called Blair and Ketchum's Country Journal. It was out in the 70s and 80s. And it had a book review for an interesting book called Apples and Man. It was written by Fred Lake. He was the director of the George Landis Arboretum in Esperance, New York. And he talked about all these old varieties of apples that we used to grow. Hey, no idea that these things existed. And what really got my attention were the names. The names of the apples were so interesting. Black Amish, cow's nut, cheap nose, cat's head, red Astrakhan, blue Carmane, white, oh heavens, there's a lot of things.
Duchess of Oldenburg.
And Duchess of Oldenburg, all kinds of names. So that's what got me interested. And at that time in the 70s, heirloom apples were way out in left field. Nobody was talking about heirloom varieties. But I read this book and I thought, well, this is kind of fun. So in the back was a couple of nurseries that were still selling some of the old time varieties. One of which was one called Baum's Nursery. It was out in New Fairfield, Connecticut. And so I sent for one of his catalogs. And it was sort of one of these things that was sort of homemade, put together. It was like typed out, and then there were some handwritten notes, and it was Xerox and stapled together and sent to you. Apples at that time were $6.50 each for a tree, which is pretty reasonable, but of course, I wasn't making a lot of money at that time either. So I sent for a few, and I bought them strictly for the names. Golden Sweet from Connecticut. Oh, there's a couple other ones, but that's one that stuck out in my mind was that one. And when these fruited and was able to sample them, I could get over the fact how good they were, how really wonderful tasting they were. It's like, why aren't we growing these things? So I started to send for more apples and find other nurseries that were sending, still selling their own varieties. And so it got to be really fun to figure all these different kinds. And I was never disappointed with the varieties that I got. Obviously, some were better for cooking, some were better for eating, of course, and some you could do almost anything with. An early memory that I had was when these trees that I grew up around were still bearing fruit. There was a good fruitful year one year, and so we collected as many apples as we could. We filled every box and basket we could find. And there was a cider mill about 8 miles away that we loaded the station wagon full and took them down there and had all these crushed and made apple cider. And my mother was going to can most of it, of course, so you could keep it, froze a little bit. But my dad would have a big one of those big glass jars, and he left one out on the counter with the cat loose. And he said, just wait. And after a couple of days, you could see it starting to bubble and fizz and swirl in there. It was really neat. And after about 5 days, he capped it up and stuck it in the fridge. And it was the best tasting cider I've ever had. It was fizzy, it was wonderful. Obviously, very mildly alcoholic at that point in time, not enough to bother. But that taste, years later, when I made my first batch of hard cider, that memory came back like an instant, just like a shot, like it was never a moment missed. That flavor was exactly the same. That's what I remember most. And so I really got hooked into it. And I started exploring with all the different kinds of apples, and I just thought it was really fun. So I started keeping track of the varieties that he had listed in his catalog and some of the other ones. And at that time, I bought a 286 computer, which if anybody has a smartwatch, that has probably more memory than my 286 computer did. I think I only had a 40 megabyte hard drive. So I started keeping track of them. I thought this is kind of fun. I'd like to learn more about them. Some of the catalogs had a little bit of information, and others had a fair bit. So I thought it'd be a good idea to keep track. So I bought a word processing program called WordPerfect, which is still available today, and I'm still using that program because I still think it's one of the best word programs there is. It's lovely, and it's been fine. So I remember when I went to school, I grew up in southern Wisconsin, of course, and I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I remember doing study halls in the Steenbach Library, which is the Ag Campus Library, because that's where my dorm was close to. This place I could get away from everybody and do homework. And I just would paw through the books at times. And there was a great apple section there. I just was interested. I thought it was kind of fun. I wasn't even thinking about apples at that point in time. But I remember a few years later when I really started getting into collecting apples that, oh yeah, this library has a really good reference set that I could go and look at apples. For the next 15 years, I would go back there every single weekend, load up a big paper grocery bag full of horticultural volumes, and spend the weekend pawing through it, finding different names of apples I could find, and putting it down in the computer. And 30 years later, I have that.
Can you hold those up so we can?
Sure.
So 7 volume set.
7 volume set of apples and pictures where I can find them. I'll tell you about the history of those, and you can see these are in the background, but I wish I learned to type. That's the one thing I never did in school. I can't type. I have 2 fingers and a thumb. It's about as good as I can do. Maybe that's why it's 30 years. But I did this just for fun, just as a hobby. Had no anticipation of it being anything other than just for my own personal interest. And at that time, about 1989, I was a member of the Seed Savers Exchange out of Decorah, Iowa. If you don't know what that is, it's the largest non-governmental seed bank of heirloom vegetable varieties there is in the country outside of Fort Collins. And so they would have a camp out every summer and you could go there. And in 1989, they planted their first apple orchard. And they collected varieties from a couple of people Nick Botner from Yontella, Oregon, Charles Stepp from Riverside, California, and another man, uh, Leonard, Dr. Elwood Fisher, excuse me, Dr. Elwood Fisher out of Madisonville, West Virginia. And they got a lot of apples from them. And they had, I think, initially 750 varieties of apples in their collection. And so I started going there. It was like being a kid in a candy store. I mean, the worst place I could probably go. But it was so much fun to see all these little bitty apple trees. They were planted on a very dwarf stock, so that would intentionally cause them to fruit a lot faster. That's why you choose a dwarf stock. And I started going there all the time, and then from there I learned to graft apple trees. I'm self-taught grafter, and I've taught grafting classes now for 38 years. And I've taught well over 1,000 people how to graft fruit trees, which is seriously fun. So to feed my habit, for apples that I couldn't buy at a nursery, I could get cuttings from and graft it myself and put it in my own collection. So I had about 250 varieties of apples in my own orchard in Edgerton. And it's kind of fun, but it was like, what am I going to do with all these apples? And so the cider mill that my folks used to take me to when I was a kid, I bought that press from them. They were retiring and closed out. So it's a 1913 Mount Gilead Model C cider press that you could put in 15 bushels of apples in at a time, and make about 3.5 to about 3 to 3.5 gallons of cider per bushel, which was great. And so then I started wholesaling to different markets in the Madison area. And so it was a great way to be able to process apples and do something with them. Plus, I had all the cider I needed as well. But
Can you explain the rootstock versus the scion and what, how?
right. When I mentioned that they planted their apples on a dwarfing stock, they used the one called P22. P stands for, it was from Poland. And it was a stock that only gets maybe 6 to 8 feet tall. The thing about the more dwarfing stock is it's precocious. It bears sooner than if you were to plant it on a semi-dwarf or even a full-size stock. The downside with the P22s is they are also short-lived stock. They will bear quicker, but they don't last as long. So you maybe get 50 years out of a dwarf stock versus well over 100 with a full size. So somewhere in between. But you choose rootstock based on, one, is your climate, two, is your soil conditions, and how big a tree do you want? If you're going to grow a tree that's going to get 25 feet tall, you need some room for this thing. So that's also a choice. So the beautiful thing about it is you have a choice. The old days, what they would do was just plant seeds of apples. When those things sprouted, then they would graft onto whatever it was. And you basically will get a full-size tree. And that's not easy for a lot of people with small backyards to take.
So in your book, you have 16,000 different kinds of apples.
Mhm.
How many different rootstocks and how many different scions?
Oh, I mean, science or whatever varieties that you ever want to put on. But
16,000 scions.
yes, potentially whatever variety there is, whether it's a wild seedling you find out in the woods or one that you know is a cultivated variety, whatever you cut from it is technically called a scion. So the amount of rootstocks available now are tremendous. You have a lot of choice. And so you can choose it based on the ultimate size of the tree it's going to be. And also particularly the zone hardiness, because I didn't realize you could really grow that many apples in this neck of the woods. So that was kind of fun to come up here and see the things that you have in your backyard that are doing wonderfully. And I think they're great. But you have to understand, you realize the microclimate that you're in, and you can grow those. So if you get farther inland, you're going to have a little tougher time. But they grow apples in Alaska. I mean, they also have moderating climates, but they're dealing with a zone almost 2 to 3. So a lot of the apples that came to the upper Midwest in the early 1800s were apples that ended up being pretty hardy. The standard ones at the time were Alexander, Hibernal, Tatovsky, and I believe Duchess was one of them as well. Antonofa is another. They were really, really hardy apples that could survive. And so, but they weren't always the best. So people were trying to come up with apples that tasted maybe better or better dessert varieties. And so there was a gentleman from South Dakota, experiment station there, that experimented with trying to find a hardy apple that could survive really bitter winters. And at the time, we had a little bit of an ice age back in the late 1800s, so there were winters that would be, well, 40 below zero was not uncommon. And that just really killed off most of the eastern varieties. So the selection was made to try to hybridize some of the apples that we knew with some of the species apples that actually existed in the United States. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit and say, the apples as we know them, the edible apples that we like, were not really native to the United States. Those apples are the Malus savorsii, which is basically from the Caucasus Mountains, the Tian Shan Mountains in western China. And then there is the European wild crab, which is the Malus sylvestris. So we have right now a combination of both of those species that are the apples that we know that we like to eat or make cider out of or whatever. So Niels Hansen from South Dakota were taking some of these apples that were grown in the East that did not tolerate being out here very well and crossed them with some of the species crabs that were in the United States. Now, the United States is a center of diversity for apple culture. In this part of the world, this is a little bit north, is the Malus iowensis, which is the prairie crab apple, as they call it, native to areas along Lake Michigan, like from Green Bay down along the coast to the Illinois-Wisconsin state line, basically traveling all the way over to Mississippi River, then up north into Minnesota. And so Niels Hansen made a couple of selections. One is from Nevis, or Elk River was the first one that he used a lot. And he created a lot of hybrids that survived really bitter cold weathers. And it tended to be an apple that was still actually fairly edible. The Malus iowensis, the prairie crab apple, was an apple that Americans did use. They would pick it, it would be really astringent and pretty nasty. So they would bury it in pits and leave it to sort of ferment for a while and mellow out. And they taught the first white people that came into Iowa and stuff how to use them and how to be able to have it. At that time, you didn't have exactly a lot of anything. So having an alternate source for food was a wonderful thing. So they were utilized, even though they were probably not the most pleasant apples in the world, but at least it was something. And so from there, a lot of apples have come along long ways. The experiment station there in South Dakota introduced quite a few over the years. I think, yeah, it always was a matter of hardiness, but now the fact that the climate has changed a little bit, we can grow a lot of things here that we really haven't been able to grow for a long time. So we have so much more possibilities. My own orchard in Edgerton, Wisconsin, which is south of Madison, I've got a little over 600 varieties in right now. And it's not a big collection. There's others that are some. But what I'm trying to look for now is, it's fun to collect varieties if you have the space and means and room and all that sort of thing. But it's really fun, the fact that apples are so different. If you find something that you really like, it's really fun to grow it for yourself. It may be one that you can't find in a grocery store or a garden center, or I should say an orchard around in the area, but if you can find one, you can raise that tree yourself. And I think that's the most interesting thing to do, is to be able to have an apple that you really like. And that's so fun of it. We did a tasting event in Des Moines, Iowa, and from the Seed Savers when I worked there. And we took 60 different apples there, and we secretly kind of cut them up into small pieces and had them on toothpicks so you could sample them. So you couldn't see what the apple looked like itself. And so the thing is, we're humans. We eat with our eyes as much as anything else. Sometimes an apple doesn't look really good. We don't think it really tastes good. The apple that most people liked there was, the apple that everybody seemed to like was an Old English variety called knobbed russet. I mentioned that earlier today when I was doing that talk. The knobbed russet is probably the homeliest apple you could ever imagine. It looks like a diseased potato. It has scab all over it. It's lumpy. It's gnarly. There's a grower in New Hampshire that raises these, and he's described his tree. It looks like a tree of shrunken heads. I mean, what a wonderful advertisement for an apple. I mean, in its time, it is a fabulous apple. It does taste good. It doesn't last really long, so you know, you have to understand apples as well. They have a span of life where they're really great flavored, and then they'll start to get mealy or mushy. But other apples, you can't pick them from the tree and eat them. They're not the best thing. You almost have to let them mellow for a little while. There's an apple from New York State called Forest Winter. It was really popular, really in southeastern Wisconsin, where it seemed to be it's where it was at its best. And so when you first pick it, you can almost pound nails with it. It's tough. It looks like a delicious, but a little bit greener shape. But if you take that apple and you put it into storage about April or May, when there's not much else in your root cellar, with no special treatment, this apple just mellows out and it's a wonderful apple. It's really good. Yes.
So, by the way, we all agreed that anybody can ask questions as we go. It gets more interesting.
Yeah, I like questions. So if you got a question
Yeah.
while you're thinking of it, ask me because later you might forget what it was or whatever. So something,
Halfway through, we're gonna stop and press.
yeah, we'll try some apples here.
Get your questions in.
Yeah.
My question is, okay, so if I see an apple that I like and I tasted it and I wanna buy the tree.
Mhm.
And I look around and I find some place to buy it. Then it gets shipped to me and then I plant it and I make sure the growth.
The grafting in.
graft
Mhm.
is above ground and I plant it. Then what happens next? What's the best way to take care of it over the years? You know, diseases and watering and all those kind of.
It's hard to know how apples grow necessarily, and there are different pest pressures and disease pressures depending on where you are. There are problems that I have that you won't have here just because it's a little cooler. The humidity is a little bit different, so that makes a difference. But one thing I wanted to mention about the forest winter that I was saying before, things is the Canadians used it in the 1930s to breed a lot of apples that stored really well. That was the thing. So you didn't need special stores like you do with apples now. So it's one of those that you can raise for yourself and you can put it away and it'll be there for a long time. So that's really important to have apples that had that, you know, chance of being able to survive for long periods of time in your root cellar with no special needs. I mean, right now they will put apples in a building, they will draw off the oxygen and introduce nitrogen. Basically, it changes they don't decay as fast. So it's sort of like gaseous embalming. That's a really terrible term, but it preserves the apples from turning. And if you don't do it right, case in point, I mentioned that earlier today too, that there was a warehouse in Wisconsin that lost almost $1 million worth of Honeycrisp because they didn't draw off the oxygen quite right and they put in nitrogen. And Honeycrisp is kind of a difficult apple at times. It gets a condition called lenticel breakdown, where the breathing pores are called lenticels. That's the spots that you see on an apple. And they just deteriorate and you basically lost the crop. So it's really kind of tough. So we're getting back to, if you find a tree at a garden center, it's typically going to be a bud grafted tree. I'll tell you the difference between different types of grafting. Bud grafting is the kind that you will see probably in every garden center. You'll see a pot and out of it comes a bit of a trunk. It'll maybe stick up about that far. And then all of a sudden there's kind of a growth coming out of the side. That's a classic bud grafted apple. Almost all garden center trees are going to be that way. Now, we will talk about in our class on grafting on Sunday, a different type of grafting called a whip and tongue graft, which is what I do, and that's what I teach, taught for, like I said, many, many years. And it's a method that I like to use. There's lots of different ways to graft fruit trees, a lot of different ways to graft all kinds of things. But to be able to keep the genetics same from one generation to the next, you have to vegetatively propagate it. And that typically is by grafting. You can't take the seeds out of an apple and plant them and expect to get the same tree. Apples are what they call heterozygous, which means is when they pollinate, they cross in all kinds of different ways. So this relates to the old adage that apples have that every apple plant's an orchard. You take the seeds out of any apple, you maybe have 8 seeds in there and plant them. Every tree that comes from those seeds will be different from the parent. Sometimes similar, but sometimes very different. And that's why, frankly, that's why there are so many different varieties of apples out there right now, because of that. It's actually much like people. If you have a mother and father, and you have 6 kids, you think they're exactly identical? Of course not. Each one can be different. And typically it's very different. So it works the same way. There was a study done on apples, a genome study, and the University of Washington and an Italian consortium looked into it, and they found that apples have 57,000 different genes that make up a typical apple. Humans only have 30,000. So apples are actually more genetically complex than humans are. And sometimes just as crazy. And so it is interesting how varied apples can be. And you can see by the pictures behind me, these were watercolors done by the USDA. They hired watercolor artists back in the day to paint apples as people were sending samples to them. And they have usually the name of the variety, they have it when it was painted, so it kind of gives you an idea when the season was, and of course, where it came from. So when I was selecting the pictures for the book, I tried to find a picture that was from where the apple originated the closest possible. The reason being is depending on where you grow an apple can change the skin coloring and the terroir. So in the USDA, let's see, I think they painted about 3,500 different paintings of apples. Of that, 1,552 varieties were distinct. There were a lot of duplicates. And the fun of going through all of those to make the selection was to see that, okay, here's an apple from Connecticut, and you're growing it all of a sudden in Missouri. That apple doesn't look necessarily the same. It can change. The terroir, climate, rainfall can influence basically how the skin coloring is. It can bloom a little earlier, and it can also ripen earlier if you take it to a more of a southern location than if it was the north. So just because you find a picture that looks like your apple and it isn't from anywhere around, it can be not the same variety as you think it might be. So terroir is yeah, that's the soil conditions and stuff. So that is an important consideration. The reason I mention that is I lived in an old Victorian home in Wisconsin for a while. Anyways, in the back was an apple tree that was a cluster trunk. It was like 6 trunks coming out of the ground, and you'd think they'd all be different, but in this case, all the apples that cluster bore was a yellow apple with a brown splush to it. And so it was kind of interesting the fact that everything was the same. A lot of times you get a root, and this will only be a red apple, and this will be a yellow one, or whatever. These ended up being all the same apples. And I didn't know what it was. I thought, well, it just must be a wild seedling or something like that. But it was a pretty good apple. I thought it was pretty tasty. A while later, a neighbor about a mile up the road came down and says, I got an apple I got to show you. And he brought the exact same thing. So I knew it had to be a cultivated variety because you don't find them, that far apart, and it could be just a chance seedling. This was definitely an apple that had been planted and cultivated. So what was it? So I started looking to try to figure out what it was based on what I knew for the color and shape and size and all those little characteristics. And I was starting to work for the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa at that point in time as an orchard manager. And so I got a cutting of that apple, and I had a chance to take a trip to Yoncalla, Oregon, to a man who had probably the largest apple variety collection in the country. He had over 4,000 different apples in his place. He had a big farm there. It's the south end of the Willamette Valley. It was just an amazing place to go. My job at that time was to go there and try to find apples that were special for the upper Midwest, because that was kind of apples we wanted to have in our collection at the Seed Savers Exchange. So I already had a list of the varieties from notes that he sent me of what ones I wanted to target to get. And one of the apples that I was able to acquire was a variety called McMahon. It came from Richland Center area of Wisconsin, center part of the state, central western. Anyways, I got a cutting of that, and I got a cutting of my apple, and I grafted them the same year. 5 years later, it bore fruit. They were identical, absolutely identical. And I knew I had a McMahon apple. But the difference was 165 miles away from where I took the cutting to where I planted and grafted it, that bronze blush was now a pink blush. And so was the apple that I got from Oregon. The lenticels were exactly the same. It was no mistaking of it. It was exactly the same apple. So it will change depending on where you are. You wouldn't think 165 miles and fairly similar soil condition would make that much difference, but yes, it can. So using a picture to identify an apple is not the best way. So it's a long story of saying that. Anyways, we have really a large list of fruit here, but I mean, that's the fun of going through all of this. I will talk about the trees in a minute. And I think the artist did such a fabulous job, but the reason they painted these was not for posterity that, oh, these are really pretty apples, we just want to know. They painted them to prevent fraud. It was done so an unscrupulous nurseryman could get a hold of somebody's prize apple from over here, take it over to his place and graft it and sell it under his name. It was a problem. So this was a way to kind of keep people honest. And it was done for that reason. And you can see some of these apples, oh, Minkler. Oh, that's Minkler here. That other one looked pretty nasty that was just before it. That's a nice old Illinois variety. The interesting thing about Minkler is when you plant apples, most of the time they'll bear maybe 3 years, but more like 5 to 7 is pretty standard. Now, on a full size, okay, depending on the kind of root that you plant your tree on, will depend on how fast it'll bear. So the seed savers, when they planted their orchard, put everything on that P22 dwarfing stock. It bore fairly quickly. That's the reason they did that. They were willing to, regraft it later if they were afraid of losing it. But the P20 or P22 bears quickly. I like to plant things on a somewhat more of a semi-dwarf stock. The reason being is I like a root system that accesses the terroir of the soil. It gets, the roots will get down deeper and it'll access the minerals in the soil and it will also access the moisture if you have a dry year. So there's a problem with dwarfing trees. Most orchards now are going into this sort of high density with a trellis, and they're on shallow root systems. They bear quick, of course. And the problem is if they get a dry year, you've got to be out there irrigating or you're going to have a problem, maybe potentially lose them. So there's a problem with a lot of orchards. I understand, like in Pennsylvania and other places, called rapid apple decline or sudden apple decline. A semi-dwarf tree will avoid a lot of that. So the thing is, what room do you have in your backyard or wherever you're going to plant apple trees? Where do you want? You want a tree that you can reach and still pick? I mean, the old adage is if you can't reach it, you can't pick it. So you want to choose a stock that usually fits you as a person or how you want to take care of it. I mean, I can have an apple picker on a pole and I can pick stuff fairly tall, but full-size tree is a kind of a tougher nut to grow because it takes a lot of space. So it's nice that we have choices that we can choose the kind of the roots that we want to grow based on what you have in the ability in your, to carry. Yes.
And what's the difference in spacing for dwarfs and semi-dwarfs?
You can plant like bud nine, which is a dwarfing stock, typically around 10 feet apart, maybe.
Okay.
If you get a semi-dwarf, like I like M7 or the Geneva series, like the 890s, the 935. So they're a semi-dwarf. Semi-dwarf will be roughly 40 to 60% of standard. That's how they're really rated, is percent of standard. It depends on the variety as well. Some varieties just are not very vigorous, but the rootstock will kind of guide that. And then a full-size one, you're going to have to plant stuff. Okay, those semi-dwarfs will be maybe 16 feet apart. 20 feet between rows is a kind of a standard spacing. You want an apple to grow out rather than up. Basically, as I mentioned before, anything that grows up makes leaves. Stuff that grows up makes fruit. That's the whole point of how you prune a tree. Encourage your side shoots because that's what's going to make your fruit. It changes the chemistry. There are some exceptions to that. As I mentioned earlier, there's an old Turkish variety called Candle Sinat. It's a beautiful apple. It came from the Black Sea area, and it's a beautiful porcelain-looking apple. It's just gorgeous. But it bears on upright wood. You can't prune that thing to make horizontal branches. It's a stinker. So each tree has a different way of growing. You have to sort of understand it. There's no cookie-cutter approach that you can use for everything. So certain apples, of course, you will know how to prune just because of experience. But it's kind of fun that way. But there's always exceptions to every rule. See, I don't know where I was going with this, but it's a choice you have now to be able to grow an apple based on the space that you've got. Now, a lot of apples, of course, some apples are more disease prone than others. Some are less so. It's hard to know. There's a lot of apples that are rated as being scab-free, and those are probably really nice for an average person. I don't see scab being a real big problem here. Down south farther, scab can be a real big problem, but you can eliminate a lot of things just by the way you grow your tree. Usually at the fall, at the end of the year, when the tree has dropped its leaves, if you're worried about scab, a good thing to do is to mow your orchard to clean it up because it'll break down the leaves where the scab spores are, so it won't they'll decompose before it reinfects your trees next spring. So there's a lot of ways you can mitigate disease pressure on stuff. Now, a lot of the apples I have here will have little subtle things. We have an issue with skin funguses, usually in the south. You can see this apple here, it's got a lot of blotches to it. It's a superficial fungus. It's a combination of two. One is called sooty blotch, and the other is called fly speck. It's not because of flies, it's just the way it is. And so you see these little dots here, and that's your typical fly speck fungus. And it does nothing to your fruit. It just makes them look a little scruffy, but it doesn't change the flavor. You can't wash it off. It's pretty much there. But it's just normal. It's just one of those things. We expect always to have spotless fruit. And if you want to spray your apples a lot to get rid of this, the fungicide will take care of quite a bit of it. But that's up to you. You can grow apples the way you want. I don't spray anymore. I used to be a conventional orchardist. I would spray stuff based on what everybody else was using, and I ended up having more problems with critters that I'd never seen before getting into my orchard. Spotted tendiform leaf miner and other things that would kind of stretch your tree. So I gave that up, and the only product I've ever used in years is a powdered kaolin clay called Surround. It turns your trees white, it turns your fruit white, but insects don't like being on it. It's what they call in the term, in the trade, a suppressant. It's like being on a bed of nails. Insects would rather go someplace else than be on it. It makes your trees look kind of scary, but it keeps them from getting a lot of problems. You can also use organic products called like neem oil and other things to prevent things as well. Yes.
Up here supposedly, we don't have nearly as many diseases because it gets so cold, you know, in winter, etc. But now the weather's getting very weird, and so last summer it was too really wet, and people got funguses. And then this year it just has been too hot, and it frosted like 2 days ago or so. So the apples aren't ripe.
Yeah.
Hard to plant.
It is hard to plant. Now, in the south part of the state, we had a very wet spring, and it got very dry and very hot at times. Then we had one cold snap, and I've seen trees that defoliated even already by this point in time. I mean, they've lost their apples and their leaves, and I've never seen that before. They would hold their apples well into October, and they're dropping them all yearly. So it's a tree by tree basis, but I've seen a lot more of that, and I'm hearing from other places as well.
Up here, the apples are still on the trees unless the bear's gone.
And, you know, I actually like when the apples hang on as long as possible because in the case of the later ripening apples, they develop their sweetness better, and the cold weather will help the coloration as well. So it's one of those things that can be an improvement to growing the fruit. Yes.
How can you tell an apple is ripe then when you leave it on the tree?
Well, one way, I mean, you could bite a darn thing, and if it tastes really starchy and it turns brown really fast, it probably isn't ripe. But the other way to do it is to cut it open and look at the seeds inside. If they're not basically uniform brown or variation of brown, they're usually, it says it's basically about ripe. It still might be a little bit early, but that's a good indication of nothing else. If you see white on the seeds, if they're sort of blotchy, white and dark, light and dark, it needs a little bit more time yet. So blossom time for me is about May 10th. That's pretty, Mother's Day is a pretty good time in the south part of the state. Up here, I gather it's about a couple of weeks later than that. So yeah, it varies. So when you read the literature, you have to look at where it's telling you where they're from versus where you're from. So that does make a little bit of a difference. But anyways, the apples that I brought today are a real mix of stuff. Some greens, some pound sweets, and yellow shoot nose. I got one variety here called the Minnesota 1734. That was a number that the experiment station had, but they never released it. But people who found it in the orchard decided it was a really good apple, so they basically got cuttings of it, and now it's been spread around. So it's one of those
I
things.
suggest that maybe you talk about IDing.
Oh, yeah.
Her,
Oh, right.
while we cut up the apples for tasting.
Well, It used to be to recognize an apple, you either had to rely, hopefully, on a picture that was from where you, where it was grown. Otherwise, you had to study an apple, and they would look at the shape of the apple, they would look at the skin color on it, they would look at the stem end, the blossom end. And there's a lot of identifying characteristics that you can use as a key to recognize what some of these varieties are. It's not always perfect, but it can give you a pretty good idea. Because a lot of information when we're trying to find old varieties of apples is you might have a description, you might not have much at all to work with, and you certainly don't have a picture. And so it is a job to try and figure it out, and some people are really good at it, I am not. But I know what I'm looking for. Look at the way that the blossom end is. There's these fleshy parts at the base called sepals. Are they closed? Are they open? I mean, everything, there are so many different ways you can characterize an apple. It's not funny. This is a variety of an apple from a commercial orchard. I don't know the name of it. It was once a commercial orchard, but it's no longer in business. Anyways, we cut it in half, and you look at how deep is this, where the stem is here. This is where the stem would have been. You look at the cavity. Is it narrow? Is it wide? Is it really deep? Then you look at the blossom end, and you look at where the stamens are. The stamens still inside? Those are the little filaments where it pollinates. Are they still there? So then you look up. There's a tube that usually comes up to the bottom here where this core is. And is it open or is it closed? That's another identifying characteristic. Then you look at the core outline. Where is that? And this one is kind of hard to tell, but here. The edge of the core here and here is made up of what they call a fibrovascular bundle. That's the cells that produce the core. Then you look at the core itself. Is the core open or is it closed? I'll cut it in half and I'll show you what I mean by that. When you cut an apple length or cross stays like this, these are the seed carpels. There are always 5 seed carpels. Sometimes they're open to the center and sometimes they're not. If they're not, they call it closed. If it is open, they call it open. So there's a lot of little things that you can look at an apple and try to figure out what it is based on these descriptive characteristics. It's an acquired skill. It takes a while to get familiar with the terminology and everything else, but we're trying to do more and more of that as a way to back up what we would do as DNA testing. Now, one thing that has changed immensely since we started working on collecting old variety is having DNA analysis. So where do you start with DNA? You have to have an apple that you know is what we say it is in order to have that in the database. I worked with a gentleman from University of Minnesota who was a grad student of Dr. Jim Wilby, who works there. His name is Nicholas Howard. He was from Dodgeville, Wisconsin, of all places. And he put together probably the best database on DNA of apples. I used to work with him collecting samples and seed samples. He was the gentleman that figured out what the true parents of the Honeycrisp apple were. The university didn't actually have the records quite right. So it turned out to be a cross of Sweet 16 and Keepsake. Keepsake is a great, good storage apple. Sweet 16 is a real pleasant eating apple. So we have that, when we figured that out. But what he has also done is there are 2 types of tests that can be taken for sampling apples. One of which is a simple test where we can tell, does it match anything that's in the database? And what he's got now is a new test that says, not just what the parents are, but what are the grandparents and the great-grandparents. He can go back many generations. We've found apples that are descended from varieties that have been around for 1,000 years, which is really fascinating, I think. One of the varieties that is the Honeycrisp apple has inside it is a variety called Rainette Franche, which means French rainette. But it's been around for centuries, many centuries. It's one of the founding apples that has come into the United States and is responsible for many of the seed, the apples that we've come to appreciate over the years. Northern Spy, which is one of the most popular cooking pie apples in New England, is from a Rainette Franche as well. Many of the russet apples that we have are also descended from Rainette Franche. So it's really fascinating when you can get really deep into the history of it. Yes.
how long have people been sort of messing in making apples?
Oh my gosh, long time. Well, the interesting thing, of course, apples are native, like I said, Tianshan mountains. And they always figured it was the bears who spread most of them because they liked the sweet apples. So they would eat them and travel on, and wherever they left deposits, that would be a new tree, of course, and they tended to be the sweeter flavored apples. So bears and horses were probably more responsible for spreading apples as we know them than people were until they decided, yeah, these are really not too bad. So hybridizing apples was not really a big thing until probably the very early 1800s. There was a man by the name of Thomas Andrew Knight. He was from England. He was a pomologist. That was the guy who studies fruit. He came out with a paper in 1804 that said, you know, we've got a really good apple here, and we've got a really good apple there. How about we try to cross-pollinate and see what we get? So that's where intentional pollination first really started, was right about that. He was the man who said, you know, there's a better way to do this instead of just hopefully, you know, planting a million little seedlings and hoping 1 out of 10,000 is worth bothering to eat. So yeah, by that way, it simplified the process, and from there, universities have taken over and basically is control the breeding. It's not by the hobbyists like guys like me that just love to grow apples. So, oh, okay,
I'll take care.
yes.
Pollination, what is the mechanism by which that is accomplished? How do you do that?
Oh, they will, simply, they'll usually use like a king blossom. That's usually the first, blossom that opens up on a terminal cluster. And they will collect the blossom from another variety and basically, and do it, or take a paintbrush and collect as many and dip it in there and then just. So it's a slow process to do it. It takes many years to cross-pollinate an apple, grow it out. But what they can do now is they have genetic markers. So the process is simple. They will know by looking at the genetics of this apple whether it's a red apple or a green one. They can tell if it's going to be sweet or sour. There's a few basic keys, so they know what they're looking for, and then they will select that particular one to grow out. So they don't have to grow 1,000 seedlings anymore. They'll grow maybe a couple of dozen or a few hundred.
It sounds very laborious.
Oh yeah. I mean, the old way was wait till something comes up. Hey, is it pretty good or not? It's a slow process. But the fun thing is, people don't realize that most of the really great apples that we've had in this country have been accidental seedlings. They were not intentionally bred. They just happened to come up. One of the best apples that Thomas Jefferson really liked was a cider called Tolliver. It looks like it's still Italian barrel, but it was just a seedling that came up that I'm trying to remember, one of his generals had in his pasture. It was a pasture. And so it ended up being one of his favorite cider apples. But so many of these are just random seedlings that happen to be good. I traveled to a place in southeastern Minnesota called a little town called Ison. There's a spot where there's a valley the 3 valleys that come together. It's an oversized cow pasture, and there's got to be 1,000 wild apple trees growing there, just spread by cattle. And my gosh, we have found wonderful apples. Apples that are great for fresh eating, apples that are russeted, apples that are beautiful colored, everything in between. Some that taste like cotton candy. We had some that even felt like it was oily. It was really strange. There's so much variation to it. It was really fun. We found one apple. I mean, we're always kind of looking for cider apples, ones that have good tannin structure and sweetness, so it makes a good hard cider. So that's a whole other thing. So when I go sampling for apples, I take a little device called a refractometer. It looks like a monocle or like a little periscope. It's a prism, and you put a couple of drops of juice solution on and close the lid, and you look through it, and there's a scale inside, and it measures in how much sugar in terms of degree Brix. That's the standard. So you're looking for an apple. Most dessert apples are around 14, 15, 16 degrees Brix. It's pretty standard. But we're finding apples that are well over 20, which is immensely sweet. The reason we use the word refractometer, you think you can just taste it? Some of the apples that have very, very strong tannins are so astringent and stuff, you can't taste the sweetness in it. So the refractometer will tell you how sweet it is without necessarily tasting it. So you're always wanting to put apples that have tannin structure within your hard cider because that's what gives your cider character and mouthfeel. A regular dessert apple that's fermented really doesn't have a lot going for it. They're pretty bland in the scheme of things. So by adding crab apples, which are typically high in tannins, can make your cider pretty tasty. So it's all fun about the experiment.
I
Yes,
just have one other question.
Sure.
This is, she was coring the apples here,
yes.
station that we had with our two daughters, one of whom has a nonprofit and has a horse rescue operation 8 miles west of River Falls,
Okay.
Wisconsin.
Sure.
And was out there and I had 4 crab apples that came from our tree on our cabin property
Sure.
that I had had in the car. Well, the reason I had it in the car was a whole nother story, but anyway, I was out there and I said, Johanna, can I give your horses these crab apples? And she said, well, you probably want to core them first. And the coring a crab apple, I said, I don't think so. I said, it's too much work for me. So I just gave them to my grandson who loves to eat them,
Sure.
but the coring off. So the question is,
Why?
Is there anything bad in the
is there
core?
anything bad in the core? Are we coring the apples just because they look better and it's easier to eat? Or is there some reason we should not be eating apple cores?
It's known that there is a very minute quantity of cyanide within the seeds.
And not
Yeah.
just apple seeds.
Yeah, it's not just apple seed. You would have to eat pounds of apple seeds to have any issues. It's something that people have read and are kind of concerned about it. Most of the time, the horse eats it and the seeds don't get digested. They travel on. And so it's not an issue. But it's one of those things that people have a memory of reading it someplace and they think they're hazardous.
Well, I was
No,
thinking
they're
of the
not.
human aspect.
Oh, no, not at all.
Eating
Nope.
Spanish cores.
Yeah.
So therefore,
There are some apples that are perfect for that. There's a crab apple called Care, Kerr. It's a wonderful crab apple. It bears in clusters almost like grapes. And it starts kind of a pinkish red and it gets past garnet to a deep, deep red. And the core is so small you can eat the whole darn thing and not even realize it. It's so good.
How would you prefer that we did this?
Now, we should do this sampling pretty soon, because some of these are turning fairly quickly brown. There's an amylase protein in apples that causes the browning.
Do you want us to come up there?
Yes, I think you should come in, and there's names on all these, but how about try some apples? Let's do that
Do you
right
want
now.
to highlight a couple of them and what, maybe?
Oh, okay, one,
First.
oh yeah, they're all labeled, but, like the golden russet is a really good flavored apple. I mean, I think really good apples. I will cut more of these up. This is a variety apple I just belong because it's a red flushed apple, which is really fun. It's an old variety called Crow. And it's different. Some of them are, there's another crab called the Geneva crab. It's actually a pretty good sized fruit, but it's still technically a crab. It is as dark red on the inside as it is on the outside. It is just gorgeous. But if you cut it crossways, there's a white star around the core, which is beautiful. So we'll talk about.
Maybe a way would be for you to talk about each one and then we pass them one by one.
Golden russet is a very old variety from basically Western New York. There is a golden rush, an English golden russet, which is very similar to it. But this one is from Western New York, probably early 1800s. So, yeah, sample that. I'm assuming most of these are about ripe as they should be. So,
Is the browning just an aesthetic thing? It's not.
yeah, exactly. It's an aesthetic thing. That's the thing with apples. That's why they've been trying to breed so it turns off the amylase protein. So basically, when you cut an apple open, it'll stay that lovely white and yellow color, or whatever the flesh is. And there are some varieties that naturally don't brown very fast. Golden russet, golden delicious, excuse me, is one. So there's a lot of seedlings of golden delicious that have that same characteristic where they take maybe hours to turn brown. But there are scientists that have been trying to turn off that amylase protein so they can sell apples in school or give away in a hot lunch or whatever. They have like apple French fries. They can slice them up and anyways, it keeps them from browning. So basically, it's defeating the decay process. The weird thing is, it's the oxidation that turns these brown. So I think of apple cider, it's an oxidized product. That's why it's brown. What would it look like if it wasn't brown? It looked like skim milk? It's not appetizing to me. So,
Want to introduce this one really quick?
okay, pound sweet. Oh, nice old time variety.
Pound sweet.
Pound sweet. A lot of people can't take the tartness in apples, upsets their stomach. So finding a sweet apple that you can tolerate is one of those things. Pound sweet is a good one. Tolman sweet is a standard that was grown all through the Midwest. It's probably one of the better ones. Yellow sheet nose. Sheet nose normally is a variety called black gilliflower, also known as sheet nose. It's dark. It's called that because it looks like a sheep's nose. That's one of the weird names that come with apples. But this is the yellow version that came, I think, from southern United States. This is Minnesota 1734. This was it was never actually introduced to commercial cultivation, but that was the number that it was grown in at the University of Minnesota. And people found it and decided it was a good apple. And it's a wonderful apple. It's a russet apple. If you don't know what a russet apple is, it's sort of that rough textured, rough skin, kind of like fine sandpaper to feel like. But russet apples, for the most part, have probably the best sugar acid balance, really a rich flavor. And I think russet apples are fabulous. They're my favorite kinds. Stolen sweet. This is from an orchard that was abandoned. We found this beautiful apple growing there. I think it's the right one. I think I have the right name for it. And I had to basically hop a fence on somebody's private land and start a cutting. So that's why I call it stolen sweet. And Calvio Blanc is a French variety. It's also, the longer name is Calvio Blanc d'Ivre, which means white winter's apple. It's a French apple. It is reported to have more vitamin C in it than an orange. It's a good variety.
Slow down a little bit, we're getting behind.
Okay, and we have the old classic Northwestern Greenie. This is a variety that came from Wisconsin about 1849. It was a very popular apple and still is for pie. It's a good storage apple. It'll hang on the tree all winter practically. So it's a nice wildlife apple for deer to get because they can find them. They don't have to dig in the ground. Yeah, let's see. I won't throw it, but Baldwin is one of my favorite apples. It's a New England variety. It was probably the mainstay apple in eastern part of the country for many generations until those really terrible winters, I think in the early 1900s, that wiped out most of the trees. I think it's still a hardy apple. It grows well with me, and it's sold for I think it's one of the best flavored apples.
You want us to cut this up?
Yeah, I might have people try it. It's kind of structural. But yeah, it's have a nice beautiful color to them. I just think it's fun. So my mother was a home ec teacher, and she taught her sons to make, considering a dubious employer, marital prospects, at least we wouldn't stop. So I can make a pretty mean apple pie. So if you don't know what to do with an apple, you can sometimes find out by holding on to it. Does it feel light for its size or heavy for its size? One that feels light is likely going to be one that's going to cook down and make more of a sauce. Where one seems kind of heavy, like a cue ball, and that's going to be one that's going to likely stay firm in a slice. So I love to mix something that's going to cook down to a sauce, something that's going to keep it shaped, and then if I can add a red fleshed apple on top of it for color, you have a beautiful pie. So that's one of the things I'll talk about in our pie baking class this weekend. Yeah, but
So what does it mean, if anything, to grow like in your orchard? There's so many different varieties near each other. I guess I don't understand the population. Does that affect how they grow up?
No. Not at all, not at all. Well, I mean, by having more trees, you're also more of an attractant for critters. Because a single tree by itself in the middle of nowhere may not have much pests and disease problems because there's nothing else there. But by having more of them together, yeah, that tree might have, some kind of an insect problem, which could spread to other trees. So having more sometimes makes it, a little bit more, you have to be a little bit more concerned about, how you take care of your trees and watching them, how you prune them, open the canopies up to get light and air and let them make the trees healthier. But that's a whole other topic conversation. But what happens though is the tree will bear an apple and it will be the apple that you want it to be. What happens is when it's pollinated from wherever it came from. It's the seeds that'll be different, not the apple, but the seeds in it. That's what I mentioned about, apples are heterozygous. Yes.
So where do you buy all of these apples? I don't find them in my grocery store.
No, that's just it. We used to grow most of these. I mean, the varieties have come and gone. So many have been lost just due to market pressure. If an orchard can't sell it, they won't grow it anymore. They're gonna go for the apple that everybody's calling for. When Honeycrisp came out, lots of apples got rooted out so they could plant more Honeycrisp. But it's, and unfortunately, we lost apples for no good reason. Yeah, simple as that. So the reason that we have as many as we do is for the fact that somebody says, these are valuable, we need to hang on to these. So they've been bracketed generation after generation to keep them going. You have to vegetatively propagate these to keep it going. I mean, we have apples from the 1200s because somebody thought it was worthwhile to hang on to. And I think that's fabulous. And there's so many good apples. Some people say, oh, the heirlooms are so difficult to grow. No, they're not. They really aren't. There are some that are a problem, but there's a lot of modern varieties that are problems just as much. So it's really no difference. It's really how you take care of it. The biggest problem I have with most commercial orchards is the fact that they irrigate and sometimes way too much. An apple that's irrigated a lot, hey, it's a big apple. If I'm selling it by the pound, boy, you got a lot of water there. It's great, but it washes out the flavor as well. It's really strange, but it really happens. A similar situation if grapes as they grow in California for wine. They will irrigate them, of course, to get the grapes up to, fruit and have lots of grape clusters and things. But later in the season, they will intentionally not irrigate. So it increases the sugars and the flavors that makes a better quality wine. Simple as that. Apples are really different. So I love having a natural grown tree in your yard that to me will have much better flavor than something you're going to buy in the grocery store. I've had wonderful Honeycrisp and I've had terrible Honeycrisp. It's how they're grown that can make the biggest difference in the world, is that. So I'm a snob. I really am. I happily admit it, but I like what I like. And there's a difference. I can tell. Some people, maybe not, but to me, I mean, does anything stand out to you as being okay or reasonable or do you remember what varieties you were munching on?
I really like a golden russet, so if I wanted to grow a golden russet, would it grow up here?
I think it probably could.
And where would you get one?
Oh, cuttings are, that's one of the more popular russet apples that you will find.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not hard to come by. If you can't, let me know and I'll tell you where you can get it. Yeah. That's, to me, one of the better ones. We grabbed these off trees. I'm assuming most of them were ripe. The fact that some of them ground as quick as they were, maybe says the sugars weren't quite there, but it's about the right season. And they were falling off the tree. Well, I always figured that was a good indication if I didn't have a chance to cut it open and see what the seeds look like.
What's the history of the Cowbell Blanc?
French variety. I have to look it up. It's a good eating apple, but that's the one I said that was really high in vitamin C, which is really good. It's a beautiful apple, I think. It's got that very protuberant crown on the bottom side, very wart or very lumpy. Some apples are really smooth and round, other ones are corrugated. It's really one of those otherwise distinguishing characteristics. Now, the Northwestern green is probably not your best eating apple in the world. Somebody sort of likened it to eating a mouthful of cotton. But he was growing them in New York State, so he doesn't know what they're like. They were always a really popular pie apple in Wisconsin. They always were, yeah. And they're hardy. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. They're good and hardy as well. Yes.
When was an apple that can you eat an apple that is called an ornamental crab?
Once.
tried that today. Oh, I was to say, is it toxic or?
No,
Not
no.
When I see this world going crazy and then there's all these apples and I think, wow, I could have crab apples, but they're all really fresh, so.
Yeah, you could certainly eat an ornament crab.
Okay.
But
Pretty.
When they make cider.
yeah, actually they could, but in small doses, they're gonna be pretty astringent, I think. There's a difference between tannins and astringency, I think, as well. There's a certain amount of bitterness, but tannins will sort of make your mouth pucker. There was an apple that I found in this orchard in Eichson. We call it the black hole. It's a small little crab, really dark colored, and you eat it, and after about 3 minutes, you can pry your lips off your teeth. But it's fabulous. And it's a little of that with the regular dessert apples will make a fabulous cider because of the tannin structures in.
What makes the difference between a crab apple and an apple?
They're the same species, actually. One is just a small apple, that's it. And, you know, the crab also generally is a tree that doesn't get very large. So in the old days, they would use crab apples as rootstock because it would be a smaller tree that they could manage in a trellis situation. Paradise was one of the varieties they used that was a crab. So the earliest apples that came over here in 1598, there was a man by Richard Hakluyt, who was a Dutch clergyman who would practice in England, and he was surveying sea captains as to what they would take with them on voyages to the New World. And there's a variety called Dusson that they used. Dusson is a derivative of the word douans, which means 2 years. So you think about this. Why this is called 2 years? This is an apple that you could harvest, throw in the hold of your ship, get bounced around on the oceans, and it would last about 2 years before it started to spoil. So they could take it with them, and it was a way to prevent scurvy. They could have it on board ship. And so the French are responsible for a lot of the apples that came into the United States, as well as the British, of course, as they settled here. It was interesting for the fact that the French would intermingle with the native peoples and live with them and settle with them because they were apple furs and everything else. And so they brought a lot of apples with them. There was an apple rediscovered on one of the islands off the coast of Maine called the Drap d'Or de Bretagne, which means cloth of gold from Brittany. And it's a very old variety. It's one of the oldest varieties that we've been able to track back in the United States is that apple. And they just found it, which was neat. And it's not the original tree because this was in the 1600s. So it's been grafted a few times to be where it is now, but they did find this variety, which is pretty astounding. Yes.
So you know when you have apples in storage, cool place,
Mhm.
and they develop that waxy. Is that a way that the apple's trying to preserve itself?
Yes, exactly. Case in point, the Northwestern green would sometimes, the skin would just get oily, feeling, kind of slick like that. That was one of its characteristics. And on the trees, as they hang all winter long, they just have this sort of oily. Yeah, it's usually they would have thicker skins or waxier skins or whatever the case may be. But that would help preserve them for a long time.
So if it's a baking apple, it's still fine to use the skins.
Yeah.
I guess that's.
You can bake, or you can do almost anything with it. That's the fun thing about it. Apples are so versatile. I mean, that's the great thing about it. And apples, when they were brought over to this country, weren't so much for eating, almost as much as it was for making alcohol. That was really one of the biggest reasons. There wasn't enough cultivatable land to produce grain to make beer. They had better things to do with the grain they could make. So apples would then tend to get planted in places where they weren't cultivated. They would be on rocky hillsides and stuff. That was a normal place to plant fruit because you didn't want to waste it for where you could plant grain, corn or rye or potatoes or not potatoes, but I'm thinking of tobacco. Yes.
The golden russet, I tasted like there was a sweetness on the skin.
Could be.
Why? I've never had that before.
I forgot the sugar, so it wasn't me that added anything to it.
Well, that was unusual though. I can't think of another apple where the skin was.
Isn't that fun to find stuff like that?
Was
Yeah, I think that's the whole point of it. Like I said, the taste, what you like in an apple isn't necessarily what I'm going to like in an apple. So, I have my favorites and I would gravitate to them. I've collected russet apples because I love russets and I've probably 26 times. That's just the fun of it. Do I need 26? Oh,
What's russet
but it's fun
again?
to grow on.
What does russet mean again?
Basically, it's just the way the skin is. It's just a rougher surface skin. It's not shiny and smooth. I work with a project in in Sauk County, Wisconsin, near Baraboo, along the Wisconsin River. In 1941, the United States Army decided they wanted to build an ammunition factory. It was this beautiful sort of flat plain. It was an outwash from the Baraboo Hills that were just to the north. So they forced 70 different farmers to leave their farms. They took over about 10,000 acres of land to build an ammunition factory. They were forced to move. They were paid paltry sum for land, but they had to move somewhere else. And it was in March of all times, March of the year. So they knocked down the farm buildings, but in many cases, they left the apple orchards that were still in the area. So the varieties that we see there are sort of a snapshot from basically 1941. That's when the last trees were planted there. So there's a lot of seedlings and a lot of wild kinds, but there are a few kinds that we know to be commercially available apples. We don't know the names, so we're trying to figure out what they are. One apple that I ran across was a red colored russet, which is not a normal color you find or russeted apples. Most of the time they're green or brown or sort of yellowish or orangish, but this was a very distinct red color. And I was just paging through my book and I ran across the description and I thought, this really seems like it could be it. Turns out that apple was just from 8 miles up the road from a nursery that was selling them. So we think it's a Dockham russet, which was, Dockham is the name of a family that moved from New Hampshire to Greenfield Township, which is just north of Baraboo. And this apple was promoted by this nurseryman in Baraboo in 1877. So we know it was around probably from the late 1850s or 1860s before it fruited and got to be known and was popular. So it was written about in a journal at that time, and I have a good description of it, no picture, but we think pretty hard that it may be the Stockholm russet. We're hoping that it is. We can tell it was a commercial variety for one thing because we found 5 trees that were in a row. Man will do things like that. We always look for order and chaos. So it's not just standard random seedlings. There's a definite space and a definite, they line right up. So we just know it's a cultivated variety. We found several others that we're still working on trying to identify. So we've sent samples off to have a DNA tested, and we hope that it doesn't match anything. So we might be actually on the right track. So we're hoping to find that out. But that's what we're doing now, is trying to find any of these remnant trees that we feel have enough quality and characteristics that we think that they can make be valuable to hang on to. Whether we find a name or not, it doesn't matter. If the apple's good, we're going to grow it. Yeah.
What's your next book? The next book?
I should write about pears, shouldn't I? No, no, not to write about pear. I've written since the apples in Wisconsin, which are basically an exploration of all the apples that I've found that originated in Wisconsin. I've located, or not located, but identified 623 different apples that originated there. A lot of which are long gone, we'll never see them again. But to know what potentially out there is the thing, to have an idea, what potentially could we discover? So the thing is, I could do that for every state in the union that raised apples. I hope to do one for Minnesota, hope to do one for maybe Illinois and Iowa. We'll see how it goes. But I'm a nerd. I like to do research, and I find it fascinating. What I'm doing now, there's 2 quotes that I like to refer to myself. One of which says, "Without fanaticism, one cannot accomplish anything." That's from Eva Peron, of all people. The other is from a Polish poet by the name of Milos Czeslaw, who says, "The living owe it to those who can no longer speak to tell their story for them." And that's been a guiding thing. I'm going through this book and I'm revising it. I'm going through every single name that's in there and trying to figure out where did that name come from? Where did the people come from that originated these varieties? Because you learn stories, you find out things that you didn't realize. Sometimes they get the names wrong. I'm trying to fix those things. So I like to basically fact check everything that's there. This is taking the rest of my life to do, but I have a ball doing it. I think it's all right for a winter project, when I'm not doing much else. This is really fun to do the research. I mean, there are weird stories like There's a man from Hannibal, Missouri. His name was Oliver Hazard Perry Lear. Now, that's an interesting name in itself. You have to think, where did that come from? Well, Oliver Hazard Perry was a commodore on the Great Lakes during the War of 1812. And he obviously had some naval battles, and I found out there's a bunch of people by the name of Oliver Hazard Perry, and then whatever their last name is. Well, anyways, he's from Hazard, Missouri, or Hannibal, Missouri, which is, if you know where
Yeah.
Mark Twain and all that, that's kind of sketchy as it is. Anyways, he married a woman who's about 15 years his junior, and he was quite a character. He introduced a number of new varieties to the trade in Missouri, and he passed away, and about 15 years later, his wife passed away. Well, I found his grave marker in Missouri. Big granite thing, and it says Lear on it, of course. And when she passed away about 15 years later, she had her epitaph carved on there. It says, he was a man, she did what she could. Said what kind of character he was. You know, it's a story I love to find. It's not written anywhere. I am finding this out for myself. You know, and that's the fun thing. Okay, there's another apple. It came from Indiana. I think around 1845 or so, called Blondin. We mentioned that earlier. So that's a strange name. Now, apples are typically named for people, places, or things, or events, I should say. So a lot of times they're named after family members. I'm trying to think. There's a lot of varieties that are named after wives or daughters or whatever the case may be. That's fine. And other ones were named for places, like it's from a certain location. Okay. But events are another thing. So Blondin is one of those things that just didn't seem to mash anything. It was not related to a family member at all. There's nothing around the area location-wise that said Blondin. But what I found out was this. The same year that this apple fruited in Indiana, there was a man plying his trade over Niagara Falls, New York. A man by the name of the Great Blondin. He was a tightrope walker, and that was the year he was doing his thing over Niagara Falls, and it was named after him. So, this is just stuff that you come by all this weird knowledge, and it's like, oh yeah, that's how it works.
How long what's the longest bearing tree that you know? Like how long can they bear, edible food?
Oh, they can bear really a long time. I'll see old apple trees that are well over 100 years ago, and you think that branches are broken off, there's a little bit of growth, they will still bear fruit. But if you really want it to bear fruit, you start pruning them. You can invigorate a tree that looks half dead by just doing some pruning, getting rid of the dead, getting rid of some of the vertical stuff that just makes leaves. All of a sudden, this tree sort of comes to life again. I've seen it happen. I've done it year after year. It's amazing you can take a tree that looks half dead and start to make it fruitful again. Not like it was 50 years ago, but it's amazing what can happen. It sort of gets that will to live again by doing a little bit of work on it.
And how rapidly can grow a tree? People who are carrying around trees and showing them that there's a new place. How fast does fruit come on some trees?
Oh, and like if you've got like a newly planted tree,
Yeah.
you say? There's an old Minnesota variety called Anoka. Or actually, no, I think it came from South Dakota, excuse me. I think it's one of the ones from the South Dakota Experiment Station. I think the Indian term for it is both sides. I think that's what it translates to. It's an apple that can bear in 2 years. So they call it the old folks apple. So you can plant a tree and you probably get a tree with an apple or two before you die, which is kind of nice. Now, another one that's really a stinker is the old Northern Spot. I mentioned before, it was probably one of the most popular apples in New England. Northern Spot is an apple that will take 10 years to bear its first apple on a semi-dwarf tree. 10 years. And I planted one. I grafted it, planted it, 10 years, one apple. After that, it started to bear more and more. And it's worth it, but it's a pokey bear. But that's not the worst. The worst I ever heard was an old Illinois variety called Minkler. Minkler, it's from northern Illinois. Anyways, it was reported on a full-size stock to take 16 years to get their first apple. What orchardist is going to plant this and get their first paycheck 16 years later? Not gonna happen. So it was grown just for, because it was a nice apple, but that's it. That's what I heard. It took 16 years.
When you prune, is it best to prune in the spring, I've heard?
No, well, depends what you mean by spring. You can prune any month with an R in it, according to my mother. So the rule of thumb, I like to wait till the worst of the cold weather's over. If you're pruning small stuff like the size of your thumb, that'll heal over within a year. But if you're pruning stuff bigger, like my arm or my leg or something, you're exposing a lot of wood there, and you don't want to do it too early because you can induce tissue damage within the tree if you prune it and it gets really bitter cold. I mean, we're talking well below zero kind of stuff. So you kind of wait till the worst of the cold weather is over. In my case, it would be late February, not January, maybe early February. So February or March, sometime before it starts to send out growth. When you start to see bud break and stuff, yeah, you want to avoid by then. If you do it too late, you're going to start getting that sap flow, and it's going to bleed sap all over the place, and it'll get black and moldy and whatever you want to try to avoid that. So there might be snow on the ground still. That might be a good time to prune. It's always a good time. And if you're doing a lot of hard pruning, you don't know, you never want to cut more than about a third of the canopy off a tree at any one time. So if you're trying to renovate an old tree that you haven't touched in years, yeah, get rid of the upright stuff, get rid of the dead wood, and then you can start to bring it down so it's more of a manageable size. The trees that the seed savers were planted on dwarf stock, when they were planted, the key thing you always have to remember is the graft union is not that far from the root, or from this soil line. If you mulch it too much, or you dig a hole that's way big and it sinks and the dirt fills in around it, that graft union can get below ground. It might send out its own roots. So what was a dwarf tree or semi-dwarf tree is now going to be a full-size one. So a lot of the trees they planted were on 10-foot spacing, and all of a sudden the graft union was below ground. So what was a dwarf tree is now a big tree. So when I got there, I had to do a lot of renovation on the trees, and I brought the average height down about 5 feet as a whole. So because the trees that were still dwarfing were so crowded over, they just died because they were shaded out all the time. Apple trees are forest edge plants anyways, and they'll survive with a certain amount of shade, but too much shade and they just won't produce fruit. They'll maybe grow and live, but they just won't produce much fruit. They need to have sunlight, enough, like a half day of sunlight at least. A lot of trees are biennial bearing. They'll bear heavy one year and very light the next, or sometimes not at all. And that's pretty common with a lot of varieties. So, if you don't see apples one year, if it isn't a late frost, it's just because it just needed time to recover and rest. But we had one weird tree at the seed savers that was a Canadian variety called Wisner's Dessert. Nice tree. It was on a standard root, and it had two main branches that came out and formed. The weird thing about it is that side bore one year, that side bore the other year. And they kept alternating all the years that I was there. Never bore the same year. It's so weird. How did that happen? I have no idea. But that's what trees do. Yes.
What about the effect of bees? How much,
It's always nice to have honeybees or someone that have around. Bees are kind of lazy. They will only travel as far as they need to. So if you can get a hive nearby or have someone that can bring a hive over and help pollinate your apples if you have a lot, that's great. But there's a lot of wild mason bees are good to have as well. They are solitary bees that you can have in cavities that build in straws, and you can have a nest box with those, and they're pretty good about. It's an osmia. I think that's the species name for it. So there's different ones like that, but mason bees are pretty good for pollinating trees as well. They don't produce any honey, of course, but you don't have the work to take care of as you do with honeybees either. So there's possibilities out there. But bees are good to have if you can help it, because then you get all this, apple blossom honey. Fabulous. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people who have bears climbing their trees? It's kind of a local issue.
I have never had to deal with bears. Ever. I've heard about it, and I just know they're really destructive. It's really tough. Fencing, or hopefully you have neighbors that have trees and they get theirs and they don't get to yours.
So if the tree is broken, you should prune it at that point, though.
Probably try to, or wait till it goes dormant and then prune it,
And then
and it'll try to heal itself. If you do make a cut on a tree, like an upright branch, try to cut it with a slant to it instead of flat. That way it doesn't trap water there. It's just trying to heal over and seal itself. That way it keeps rot from happening. But there are very few old apple trees that really aren't hollow in the center. I mean, most of them tend to get that way after a while. It's the outer cambium layer, it's the growing part of your tree. And the rest of it's just tissue that holds the rest of the tree up. That's about it. So anyways.
Is there a last thing you want to leave us with, and maybe ask your individual questions, if that works? So it's almost 7:30, I know.
Okay, you got a question?
They're not really keeping bears away in a ammonia bag.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it like the X-rated peanut butter? We did it.
Hey, whatever
It
works.
worked.
Good.
It did not come back.
Yeah, I've just never had to deal with bears. That's totally out of my,
Yeah,
out of my
you
use.
got a problem.
Oh, yeah, I hear that.
Also pine sol. Drip a line of pine sol around.
Yeah. But sometimes, having dogs around that they hear as much as anything sometimes might deter them, but I don't know how effective that is, and maybe the dogs are scared of the bears. Okay.
The other tree, with the ugly head, it's the ugly face tree, is that a tree that's available, if you can buy it?
I know I can do cuttings. If you're interested in things, contact me, and I can probably scare you up some cutting. Or potentially I could graft you a tree and send it to you.
What's your contact information?
Okay, my email address is cider-dan, see, that's one word, @gmail.com. Happy to converse with you. It's a fun hobby that can unfortunately get really out of hand if you don't know when it's quit. So.